All right, good morning, everyone. Hope you all had a good weekend and that you've all watched the film that was assigned last week, Division Street. Everyone watch that? Good. Yeah, it's a good film, a lot of good information there, specifically regarding some of the concepts that we've been talking about with corridors and wildlife migration and how our impacts on the environment are something that we need to begin to correct with things like wildlife bridges and tunnels and some of the other mitigation measures that they talked about. So today we're going to be doing a little review for exam 2, because exam 2 is what day?
Thursday.
April 1st.
Thursday. I think Jackson. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to make the same mistake last time. My headphones are in. Okay. Now I can hear everyone. I did that. I don't know if it was this class or another class, but the entire class I left the headphones in and couldn't hear what anyone was saying. I think it was this class. Sorry about that. All right. So today we're going to be doing a review for exam 2, which is on Thursday, of course. Same time as our typical class time, so 9:30 a.m. And without further ado, I'll bring up the quiz and I'll share my screen, and we'll do it similar to the way we did last time, where it's going to be, when you're taking the actual practice quiz, it's self-paced, and that at the end of it, we'll go back through and review the answers. So I'll just bring this up. All right. Does everyone see that? So you're going to go to joinmyquiz.com, and then you're going to enter the join code 348772.
Hi.
Almost there. Still have 4 more of you who need to join. Anyone else joining who needs another minute? Okay, I will take that as a no. I assume my speakers are working. Oh yeah, I heard Annie, so I know my speakers are working now. Okay, so we will begin. Again, this is going to be self-paced. I wouldn't worry too much about like points. You know, you get more points for answering quickly, but you get far more points for answering correctly. So focus on answering the questions correctly rather than being as fast as possible. I want you to, take this as it's intended, as a way of practicing for the actual exam on Thursday. So it's not really about speed. That's just kind of makes it a little more fun. All right, here we go. Starting. All right, so that's it. Congratulations, Jackson, Jonathan, and Annie for being our top 3. And we are going to go through and review these because the overall accuracy for the class as a whole was 48%, which means that if you flip a coin, you might do slightly better on the questions. So obviously we want to do better than that on Thursday. So let's review the questions. All right. So, and by the way, all of your questions were randomized. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, actually. So they wouldn't freak out that people were maybe answering more quickly than you were, because everyone's questions were in a different order. So the order that we see these in is going to be different than probably the order you saw them in the exam. All right, so first there's a higher probability of localized species extinction in large patches as compared to smaller patches. right? And of course, the correct answer, what's this showing me here? Anyway, the correct answer is
False.
false. Thank you. So it's false. Why is that false? We're gonna have some participation here.
Well, higher biodiversity and a larger patch. So
Yep, higher biodiversity, you have higher population stability because you have a greater amount of resources, you have greater diversity in the gene pool, and so populations tend to be more stable in larger patches. All right, next question. If I can find my mouse here. Here we go. Which of the following is the most appropriate analytical model for assessing a natural landscape in which conditions change gradually across a given distance? And the options were gradient model, the PCM or patch corridor matrix model, ecocline model, edge effect model, landscape continuum model. The correct answer was gradient model. Can someone tell me why gradient model was the correct answer? How is that different from the patch corridor matrix model? Anyone?
Well, with a patch matrix, they don't really change gradually. It has more defined edges, right?
Exactly.
And
So
it changes gradually.
the patch corridor matrix model assumes that the individual elements within the landscape, the patches, corridors, and matrix, as the name implies, are all relatively distinct from each other. Whereas the gradient model assumes that there's a gradual change in conditions across the landscape. What about the ecocline model, the edge effect model, and the landscape continuum model? Why weren't any of those right? Anyone? Those aren't models, or at least they're not recognized models in landscape ecology. So I made those three up. So there are only two widely accepted models for assessing landscapes and landscape ecology, and that's the gradient model and the PCM model. Next question. What is an ecotone? Right, and you had a couple of different options to choose from here. So those include an area of transition between two ecological communities, a separate ecosystem from either of the adjoining ecotopes, an area of high biodiversity, an ecosystem that experiences heightened edge effects, or all of these. And the correct answer was all of these. Right? So a lot of you, actually most of you, answered an area of transition between two ecological communities, which of course is correct. But all of those other statements about ecotones are correct as well. So the best answer was all of these. And if anyone has any questions about why the answers are the way they are for any of these as we're going through them, just stop me and feel free to ask, or a question related to any of these. All right, next we had a diagram which doesn't show up very well in this format, but it showed 4 patches labeled A, B, C, D, and it said which of the patches depicted below, or in this case to the left, would be most impacted by edge effects. And the options were patch A, B, C, D, or they are all impacted to the same degree by edge effects. So the correct answer in this case was patch D. Who wants to tell me why patch D was the correct answer? Looks like most of you got this one.
Just because like its central area is like a lot smaller than the rest. And I guess like the patches are the edge boundaries are kind of the same size, but because of that central area being so small, it has like a big effect on it.
Exactly. So the width of the edge in all of those is the same, but the proportion of edge to overall patch size is much higher for the small patch than it is for the larger patches. And that's why that smaller patch is going to be the most impacted by edge effects. Good job. Next up, which of the following terms describes a relatively homogeneous landscape classification unit, such as a forest or a lake? And actually, I should be hiding the answers so I can have you guys tell me what they are, but you already saw this one. So the options were ecotope, ecotone, ecocline, matrix, and patch. The answer, of course, for this one, as you can see, was ecotope. I'm going to turn these off for the next one so that I can ask you guys for the answers. And so an ecotope is basically just the smallest, relatively homogeneous landscape classification unit. So when we're, and I've been using the term ecosystem or landscape type interchangeably with ecotope. And for the rest of the semester, now that we know that term, we'll actually be using the term ecotope. So it just refers to a homogeneous area like a forest, a lake, agricultural field, suburban development, whatever it might be. All right, let's hide these answers now for the next one. Here we go. All right, next question. The film Division Street features which noted landscape architect? The options were Richard Foreman, Carl Troll, John Wesley Powell, Cyrus Thomas, and Gifford Pinchot. What was the correct answer?
Wasn't it Richard?
Richard Foreman, yes, several of you said that. So part of the way you could know that is that, well, he's mentioned in the film and they show his little name underneath when he's speaking. Richard Foreman was, I think I mentioned this to you guys, he was my professor when I took landscape ecology in grad school. And the other reason that that's a good option is that the other 4 people listed here are all deceased. So they are not in the film and they've all been deceased quite a long time. All right, question 7. Which of the following types of edges will have the greatest filtering effect? The options were wide edges, narrow edges, tall edges, short edges, or boundary edges. Correct answer is?
Wide edges.
Wide edges, correct. So looks like a good number of you got that. So good job with that. According to the film Division Street, the most remote point in the lower 48 states is how far from the nearest roadway? So this one, it depends how well you were paying attention when you watched the film. The options were 2 miles, 8 miles, 22 miles, 86 miles, or 147 miles. What was the correct answer?
22.
22 miles, correct. And that was some information that the group of guys who was hiking out to that location, they got that information from a researcher who helped them identify where it was. All right, next up. The ARC International Design Competition solicited which type of, or that should say solicited ideas for which type of wildlife infrastructure? The options were a wildlife corridor master plan for the Denver region, a wildlife bridge over a highway near Vail, Colorado, a wildlife tunnel under a highway near Vancouver, British Columbia, a habitat restoration plan for a forest in Idaho, or a system of patches and corridors to replace a burned landscape in Central California. And the correct answer was?
Vail.
Vail, correct. So, and that's just a matter of having watched that short film that was part of the lecture on corridors. Whoops. According to Paul Hesburgh's TED Talk about wildfire management, native forests of the Western United States historically developed a dense, continuous canopy rather than the patchy clusters of trees that we see today. pretty evenly split on this one. What was the correct answer for this?
False.
False.
I hope.
Yes, it was false. Why was it false?
There was
Go ahead.
like smaller wildfires that would control large dense forest populations, so it would be more patchy rather than one big area.
Exactly. So historically, the native forests were very patchy and they would have open spaces between them. But because of our fire suppression practices and our desire to prevent fire at all costs, or at least that was the prevailing goal during most of the 20th and now into the 21st century, we've allowed forests to grow up into a continuous canopy, which is never what it was historically. And as a result, we have much more intense and long-lasting fires and a much longer lasting wildfire season because of the way that we've managed those forests. Good job. Another question about Division Street. The film Division Street is primarily concerned with what type of landscape corridor? Disturbance corridors, environmental corridors, planted corridors, conservation corridors, or remnant corridors?
Disturbance.
Disturbance corridors, correct. And you could kind of make an argument, I suppose, for conservation corridors, but really the thrust of the film was about how roadways are cutting up our landscape, and roadways are probably the most prominent type of disturbance corridors that we have in the landscape. And that was most of what the film was about. Which of the following are descriptions of patch origins? Select all that apply. Options: environmental variability patches, disturbance patches, remnant patches, introduced patches, or fragmented patches. Which of these are patch origins? All right, well, I'll just show them. So environmental variability patches, disturbance, remnant, and introduced patches. Fragmented patches I made up. If there was such a thing as fragmented patches, it would basically be a remnant patch. So remnant patches are the result of human activity that fragments the landscape. So fragmentation is the result of remnant patches, or at least closely tied to remnant patches. Which of the following statements are true regarding the patch depicted below, or in this case to the left? Select all that apply. So options: it has a higher ratio of edge to area than a circular patch. So is that one true?
Yep.
Yes, definitely true. It provides more interior habitat than a circular patch of the same size. That one is, if the first one's true, that one has to be false. Third option: organisms are more likely to move across its boundary than along its boundary. Is that one true?
Yes.
Yes. Why is that?
Because the boundary is so much larger than the interior.
That's part of it.
The space
Else?
space between is also it's just a shorter distance. So kind of like what you were saying with some species, if they can see like the next patch that they're moving to, then they're more likely to just go across.
Yeah. And what else? What about the shape of this patch? That's kind of the primary clue here. The fact that it's got a curvilinear boundary to it is going to mean that organisms are more likely to move across the boundary than along it. So when you have a very straight boundary animals tend to move along that boundary and not cross it as much. When you have a very curvilinear boundary, animals are more likely to cross that boundary. Fourth option, it likely has a greater number of edge species than a circular patch of the same size. Is that statement true or false?
True.
Correct. It likely has a greater number of edge species because it's got a greater amount of edge habitat. And then finally, its boundary is unlikely to change over time. That one is false. Boundaries, especially naturalized boundaries, change all the time. And in fact, that's one of the clues that this is a boundary that's that is likely to change over time, is the fact that it's so curvilinear. If this was a straight boundary, then the answer to that last one would actually be true, that with straighter boundaries, they're unlikely to change over time because typically those are maintained by human activity. So the correct answers for this were A, C, and D, or the first, the third, and the fourth. All right, next one. Which of the following terms describe the hedgerow corridors depicted in the following image? Select all that apply. So are these hedgerow corridors convex or concave? They can only be one or the other. Which are they, convex or concave? 6 of you got it right, so that should be a hint.
Convex.
Yes. So convex means that the corridor is basically higher than the surrounding matrix. Concave means that the corridor is lower than, or it's like a trough that runs through the surrounding matrix. So that's what concave and convex refer to. They refer to, if you cut a cross section through that corridor, is it popping up above the surrounding matrix, or is it dipping down below the surrounding matrix? All right, conduit, is that a good description?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's a fairly connected series of corridors that can be conduits for wildlife. Abiotic. Is it abiotic?
No.
No, it's not. Abiotic just means that it's not living. And these are obviously hedgerows with living plants, so that is kind of a nonsense answer. And then finally, network. Is that a good description?
Yeah.
Yeah, all of the corridors are interconnected. Species are moving through that landscape that are reliant on those corridors, have multiple options of how to move through that landscape. And so it is indeed a network. So correct answers there were convex, conduit, and network. Which of the following phrases could be used to describe the landscape mosaic pictured here? Select all that apply. The options were habitat fragmentation, remnant patches, disturbance patches, high contrast edges, or wide ecotones. So are we seeing an example of habitat fragmentation here? Come on.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So looks like most of you got that one right. Remnant patches. Are we seeing remnant patches here?
Yes.
Yeah, remnant patches and habitat fragmentation go hand in hand. Those are basically one and the same. So when you see one, the other is also true. Do we see evidence of disturbance patches here? I can call on people. Annie.
No.
Oh, okay. Who is that?
I said no.
You said no. No disturbance patches. Why is that? What is a disturbance patch and How would we know if we saw it?
Wouldn't it be like man-made things like roads and walls and stuff like that?
It can be, but when we're talking about large, and typically when we're talking about disturbance patches are actually natural types of features. So disturbance corridors are the more frequent type of thing that we see that's a man-made element like roads and walls and so forth. So with patches, disturbance patches are typically a result of natural phenomena like fires or floods or windstorms. And we don't really see any evidence of that in this photo. How about high contrast edges? Is that
Definitely.
definitely high contrast edges, right? It's like the forest stops and the field starts and there's not really much in between. So that's true. And then wide ecotones. Are we seeing wide ecotones?
No.
No, because that goes, again, that it kind of goes hand in hand with high contrast edges. A high contrast edge is going to have a narrow ecotone. There isn't much of a transition area between that field and the forest. All right, where'd my mouse go? Here it is. So correct answers were habitat fragmentation, remnant patches, and high contrast edges. An ecotone is defined as, which of these was the correct answer? Okay, Casey.
It's the. Sorry, I just had to switch to my phone, so it's not really loading. I can't really see the question.
Got it. Okay. I will switch. Alonso. Which one?
A region of transition
Correct.
between two. Yeah.
Correct. A region of transition between two ecological communities. That is the definition of an ecotone. The others are definitions of other things which also popped up in this quiz, so we won't cover those just yet. So correct on that one. What are the two factors that determine the total amount of edge habitat in a patch? And the options were patch shape and edge width, edge height and width, hydrology and soil chemistry, hydrology and edge width, permeability, and patch shape. Most of you got this one right. Correct answer was patch shape and edge width. Those are the two factors that are going to determine the amount of edge habitat, right? So the patch shape, the more circular it is, the lower the ratio of edge to center will be. And so the more wavy it gets, the higher that proportion is. And then of course, the width of the edge is going to affect the total acreage of the edge habitat. I'm going to go a little faster because it's 10:24 and we still have a bunch of questions to get through. So which of these patches has the most permeable edge? Does anyone want to take a stab at this?
I picked C.
You think C. Why do you think it's C?
Just because it has the most edge. That was my reasoning.
Yes. And that's good reasoning. So that actually is the correct answer, is C. And there are two factors here that are affecting permeability. One is that it's got a curvilinear edge to it. So curvilinear edges are going to be more permeable than straight edges. So that C has that going for it, but so does A. But the other thing is the edge width, and the wider edges are going to be more permeable than narrow edges. Right? And again, C has that going for it over A, so C is the best answer. Good job. Which of these options correctly lists the edge geometries in descending order from most biodiverse to least biodiverse? And before we review which one is the correct answer, how can you even assess which ones have the greatest biodiversity?
curvilinear edges.
Exactly. So basically, the more complex and curvilinear that the edge is, the greater the biodiversity will be, because it's providing a greater range of habitats within that edge condition. Right. So if we're looking at going from most biodiverse to least biodiverse, the most complex edge here is C, followed by D, and then A, and then the simplest one is B. So the correct answer is C, D, A, B, which is the first answer here. Ta-da! Most people got that one right. All right, next question. Corridors are narrow patches that may act as links or barriers in a landscape, influencing dispersal of plants and animals. True or false? Most of you got this right. The answer is true. And that's just a matter of memorizing what the definition of a corridor is and how they operate. Which of the following are basic attributes used to describe a corridor? Again, this was in the lecture on corridors. The options were width, composition, length, height, and permeability. So anyone want to take a stab at what the correct answers were here? And again, this is something that's just listed in that lecture if you go back to it. Anyone? So correct answers here were the width, composition, and length. Height and permeability are, I would say, attributes of corridors, and you can use them to describe corridors, but they're not considered among the basic, the 3 basic attributes that are used to describe them. Which of the following terms describes the breaking up of habitat or vegetation types into smaller, disconnected sections, generally as a consequence of human land use patterns? And pretty much everyone got this right. Fragmentation is the correct answer. That's just literally a definition of fragmentation there. Habitat fragmentation decreases the total area of habitat, but has a proportionally much greater impact on which type of habitat. So the options are edge habitat, interior habitat, ecotone habitat, wetland habitat, or matrix habitat. What is the correct answer here, Ben?
I think it's I think I put edge.
And that's actually a good guess, but happens not to be correct.
And then interior, I'm guessing.
It's interior, correct. So the interior habitat, even though habitat fragmentation is decreasing the total area of habitat, it has a proportionally much greater impact on interior habitat because it greatly increases the amount of edge habitat that remains behind. And so you have much less interior habitat. And so it has a much greater impact on interior habitat than it does on the actual edge habitat. So the edge habitat isn't really necessarily changing all that much. You just have a lot more of it. Whereas the interior habitat gets drastically smaller and therefore it's much more severely impacted. All right, which of the following options lists the corridors depicted below, or in this case, to the left, in increasing order of connectivity from least connectivity to greatest connectivity? And in this case, you just need to understand what makes for a good corridor that's going to allow for passage through that corridor. And which of these is the best corridor for to serve as a conduit for species? D, correct. Basically, a wide straight corridor is going to be the best because that provides the most protection from the matrix and the most direct route between the 2 patches, right? So that is going to be the best option in terms of connectivity. And then it just, if we're going, wait, which way are we going? Increasing connectivity. So the one with the least connectivity is C, because that basically has no corridors, just two disconnected patches. So C is going to be the least connected. Then A, because of stepping stones. B at least is continuous, but it's got varying widths and some very narrow areas. And then D is the best one. So C, A, B, D, which is the second option, is the correct answer. That was kind of evenly split between that and the first answer, but that was the correct answer. Which of the following is true of DEI, depth of edge influence? Select all that apply. Options are, it is the depth to which edge effects penetrate the patch. There is no one right way to measure DEI. DEI is consistent on all sides of a patch. DEI is typically greater for biotic influences than for abiotic influences. And DEI is typically greater for abiotic influences than biotic influences, so the opposite of the previous option. So let's assess each of these. Is it the depth to which edge effects penetrate the patch?
Yes.
Yes, that's the definition of depth of edge influence. The second one, there's no one right way to measure DEI. Is that true or false? Annie.
False.
No, that one's actually true. So that was something that we discussed in the lecture, is that researchers all kind of vary in how they measure DEI, and there's no one accepted right way of measuring it. So that statement is correct. DEI is consistent on all sides of a patch. That I will just say is false, because in order for that to be true, the edge would have to be the same width all the way around, and it typically is not. The next option, DEI is typically greater for biotic influences than abiotic, and the other one is it's greater for abiotic than biotic. So which has a greater influence on depth of edge influence? Is it biotic factors or abiotic factors? Brendan.
Abiotic.
Actually, it's biotic. So biotic factors are going to have a greater influence on depth of edge influence than abiotic, because biotic factors, like animals, they can move, they can walk around, they can travel into a patch, and they can have negative consequences for that patch. So the biotic factors actually have a much greater depth of influence than the abiotic factors. So overall, our correct answers for this one were the first one, the second one, and the fourth one. Animals move across the landscape for which of the following reasons? Select all that apply. This one most of you got, so I won't dwell on it. It was A, B, and C. So maintenance, dispersal, and migration were the correct options. Animals often, they do not choose to move across the landscape to become extinct or for subversion. That was just kind of a nonsensical answer. What does maintenance refer to in animal movements? Dispersal and migration we've talked a lot about. Maintenance a little bit less so, but it was in the reading. What does maintenance refer to?
Isn't that like the day-to-day stuff?
Yep, that's the day-to-day stuff. So finding food, nesting, finding a mate, all that kind of stuff. That's all part of maintenance. All right, next one. According to the film Division Street, which national park has been doing pioneering work in providing wildlife crossings over and under highways? And the options were Banff, Rocky Mountain, Yellowstone, Denali, or Grand Teton. Most people chose Yellowstone or Banff. Which one is the correct answer?
Banff.
Banff, correct. Where is Banff National Park?
Canada, Alberta.
It's in Canada. Yeah, it's in Alberta, Canada. So they've been doing, they kind of got the earliest start with doing a lot of this research and experiments into different types of wildlife crossings, and their efforts in that region are highlighted in the film. An ecocline is defined as, and this is just knowing the definition of an ecocline. And so this one I won't spend a lot of time on because most people got it right. A gradual continuous change in species composition or physiochemical characteristics between two ecosystems or communities of organisms across an environmental gradient. It's a mouthful, but basically it's if you're measuring along a cross section of an environment, it's the gradual continuous change that occurs along that line. That is the ecocline. The portion of the landscape labeled as A in this diagram represents which of the following? Select all that apply. And the options were ecotone, ecocline, ecotope, a good place for hunting, or a transition zone. So let's go to Cam. What were the correct answers for this one?
Transition zone and ecotone. And I don't know if a good place for hunting was a joke, but it might be.
Actually, that was not a joke. And in fact, that one is also correct.
Okay.
Yep. So that is indeed the ecotone because it's the place of transition. That's the definition of it. And so it is, of course, also a transition zone. And it is also a good place for hunting. So those three were the correct answers. Why is it a good place for hunting?
Is it because the animals move along the boundaries usually?
Yeah, well, basically ecotones are places where wildlife from the two adjoining ecotopes kind of mix. And so you have a much higher population levels in the ecotone, and you have much higher biodiversity. So it's just a place that's rich with lots of species. And lots of species spend at least part of their time in the ecotone. So it's a good place if you're looking to hunt game or wildlife. That one already showed up, so I'll just leave it on. The DEI or depth of edge influence is always consistent regardless of the species and phenomena being studied. That, of course, is false because it's actually always different depending on the species and phenomena being studied. Even within the same patch, that depth of edge influence can be different depending on whether you're looking at the penetration of sunlight or the penetration of wind or where temperatures drop off or whatever it might be. So it's entirely dependent on the species that you're studying and the specific phenomena that you're interested in. According to the short film Learning from Lyme, what impacts do typical human development patterns have on wildlife? Select all that apply. So the first one, an increase in the population of animals that carry human transmissible diseases. Is that something that happens as a result of typical human development patterns?
I said yes, yeah.
Yes, it is, absolutely. Second option, a decrease in the population of predators that help control disease vector populations. That one is also correct. And in fact, that is why there's an increase in the population of animals that carry those diseases. Is there a reduction in biodiversity?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're fragmenting the habitat, right? And when humans fragment the habitat, we've seen that that reduces the biodiversity. Increase in biodiversity, obviously not correct in that case. And a decrease in the population of vector species is also not correct. So the first three there are correct. And again, these were all shuffled, so they would have been in different order in your exam. A large patch is likely to have a greater variety of habitats and therefore greater biodiversity than a smaller patch, and almost everyone got this right. So the answer is true. And this is something we've already talked about a bunch of times today. Which patch shape has the lowest possible ratio of edge to area? The options were circle, square, triangle, hexagon, or all patch shapes have the same ratio of edge to area. So which one is it that has the lowest possible ratio of edge to area?
The circle.
The circle, correct. And that was just something that was discussed in the patches lecture. And that is the smallest possible, the lowest possible ratio that you can have. Anything other than a circle is going to have a higher ratio of edge to area. And the more complex the edge gets, the more sides it has, the more curvilinear it is, the higher that ratio is going to be. Naturally occurring edges are usually blank, whereas human created edges tend to be blank. And this one, most people got right. So the correct combination was that naturally occurring edges are usually curvilinear and human created edges tend to be straight. All the other options are incorrect. A few of you chose that last one. You got the first part right, curvilinear, but complex is incorrect because human created edges are generally very simple and straight and not complex at all. This diagram depicts the ecologically optimum, quote unquote, patch shape. And most of you got that right. The answer is true. That was something that we discussed in the lecture on patches. Almost done here. Oh, we are done here. That was the last one. All right. So I am going to get rid of that. I will stop sharing my screen. There you all are. All right. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what to expect on Thursday. I highly recommend, I recommended this last time around. I don't know if many of you did it, but I definitely recommend putting together some kind of a cheat sheet or let's call it a reference sheet. You're allowed to review all of your materials during the exam, so it's not really cheating. But I would recommend that you put together some kind of a reference sheet that helps you remember where different concepts and different types of information were conveyed in terms of which lectures contain that information, because that'll help you. You know, if you know that we talked about depth of edge influence in lecture X, then you know to go to that lecture to find information if you get a question on depth of edge influence. So I highly recommend you do that. And in fact, just the process of going through the lectures and writing down what topics are covered in each one is a great way of reviewing and studying for the exam. So like I said, overall accuracy on this practice one was 48%. That's less than half. So you guys have some studying and preparation to do. And does anyone have any questions about Thursday's exam before I let you all go? It's pretty much the same structure as last time in terms of the types of questions. You had them on the practice exam today: true, false, multiple choice, or multiple answer. And that's about it. So get studying, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott.
Hey, Scott, do you have a moment to chat? Scott,
Yes,
do you have a moment?
I do.
So I missed Tuesday's class. I was preparing for our mid-review for capstone.
So a week ago.
What?
So last Tuesday's class you missed?
Yeah, 1 week ago.
Okay.
I wasn't able to talk to you obviously on Thursday because we did the
Right.
street.
The film.
Wondering, I saw that we did an activity 2.
Yes,
Can I make that up?
you could make that up. Actually, don't even worry about it because it wasn't graded. It was basically just an activity to, to basically make sure people were engaged and paying attention during the lecture.
Yeah. And then
but,
I saw
yeah,
that there was a
watch-
reading 2 quiz. Can I make that up?
That you can definitely make up, and that you should make up. So what's a good time? Do you want to do it? I can open it up right now if you want to take it now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so let me go into Canvas here.